When I was a graduate student here in the 1980s, the intellectual scene in the humanities clustered around conversations in literary theory and philosophical hermeneutics. Postmodernism ruled in the discourse of the human sciences, and one of my involvements was the Theory Group, a monthly seminar that discussed the new literature. Not only graduate students in English, but also in religious studies, German and French lit, history and philosophy, met at the Colonnade Club, where lunches sometimes dragged late into the afternoon. This is how I first came to know Richard Rorty, the former university professor who the New York Times called one of the world's most influential contemporary thinkers when he died in Palo Alto, California last June. Professor Rorty was right in the middle of all the intellectual ferment, a catalyst of it, of course, and seemed to be having the time of his life. But he was not at all your usual pomo with the black jeans and gravity-defying haircut. For one thing, Mr. Rorty preferred khakis, a wrinkled dress shirt, and a navy blazer he threw on a chair whenever he entered the classroom. More importantly, he wanted us to know that reading books and talking about theory must do more than make us interesting scholars. Books and theory should also make us compassionate citizens. Standing in the tradition of such critical patriots as John Dewey and Herbert Croly, Rorty advanced a pragmatic standard of truth and insisted that progress and knowledge in society should be about attending to and solving the specific problems that obstruct ever more novel, ever richer forms of human happiness. Rorty's arguments and his cautionary words were well aimed at a generation of graduate students living in Reagan's America, concerned more about their psychosexual adventures than the staggering numbers of homeless and unemployed pouring onto our nation's streets. Mr. Rorty criticized philosophers like Michel Foucault for a dryness produced by a lack of identification with any social context, any communication, a criticism he brilliantly recast in his 1997 Massey Lectures at Harvard, published as the splendid volume, Achieving Our Country, Leftist Thought in 20th Century America. Rorty spared no punch in his attack on the political evasions of the contemporary academy, which he accused of siding all too often with the etherealized politics of academic radicalism and forgetting the reformist, get your hands dirty disciplines of the old left he loved so much. Mr. Rorty also weighed in on the debates about postmodernism and religion currently in vogue. One trendy movement in theological studies at the time was that of deconstructionist theology. If you were a deconstructionist theologian, you believed that the disappearance of God and the disappearance of the self, as advanced in the discourse of modern atheism and in postmodern theory and philosophy, did not signal the end of religion, but in fact created exhilarating new possibilities for self-expression. For my money, one memorable afternoon in Jefferson Hall marked the end of the deconstructionist theology movement as I had known it, and at least for my own mind, further exposed the exhaustion of a certain theological habit of trying to make the idea of God palatable to modern culture by hooking up with theoretical and philosophical trends. It was not quite the momentous Black Day in August 1914, which the Swiss theologian Karl Barth described in his book, The Humanity of God, when 93 German philosophers and writers proclaimed their support of the war policy of Kaiser Wilhelm II, the day Karl Barth realized that he could no longer follow the direction of 19th century Protestant theology. Their ethics and dogmatics are their understanding of the Bible and of history. It wasn't quite that, but it was close. The deconstructionist theologian, who liked to call himself an atheologian, began with a quote from a then fashionable book called The Parasite, which included a scene of rats chewing on a Persian rug in the Paris sewers. The atheologian proceeded to talk about the demonized other of the West, and to accuse Mr. Rorty of promoting a dialogue that concluded in a monologue, spoken/written, to colonize the other. Rorty was called a cultural imperialist, a privileged white male, wielding his machete of irony against the otherness of the other, hacking away at the difference of the different, at an other that is forever other, a difference that is always different. The book, called The Parasite, included such chapters as Rats' Meals, Satyrs' Meals, Rats' Dinner, More Rats' Meals, Lunar Meals, Meals of the Lord in Paradise, The Cows Come Out of the River, Cows Eat Cows. And it was praised for its capacity to unsettle the logocentrism of the Western tradition. I refer you to a forlorn 1989 University Press of America volume entitled On the Other, Dialogue and Our Dialectics, for more on rodents and the cows eating the cows. As far as Rorty's own response to these charges that fine spring afternoon in 1989 in the Jefferson Hall Symposium, let me share with you two gems. First, quote, Pascal earned himself a footnote in the theology books by distinguishing between the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob and the God of the philosophers. Since Pascal's time, the former God has remained about the same, but the latter God has gotten weirder and weirder. Second, quote, as the old-fashioned kind of atheist, the kind without the slash, the kind who believes that when you die you rot, I keep wishing that we didn't have any theologians. The world would be a better place if we all just went away. Well, as much as I enjoyed this performance, I think deconstructionist theology was too easy a target. Ridiculing the flaws of an intellectual franchise doomed from the start by its overwrought management was intellectual overkill, pure and simple. Mr. Rorty's thrashing of the postmodern slashers, as he called them, got out of hand. I don't mean in the sense in which he confided in me the next day in his office in New Cabell Hall that he was feeling a little ashamed of himself. I reassured him he had no reason to second-guess his response. His was the most brilliant piece of stand-up comedy I have seen to this day. I mean, I wish I could have helped Mr. Rorty understand that the kind of theologian he had publicly and deservedly mocked had long been exposed for fraud by theologians of a very different stripe. Over the past several years, as our nation has been at war and the global and world community have grown ever more troubled, my thoughts have turned time and again to sermons preached by Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. in the final years of his civil rights ministry. A Christmas sermon on peace, I See the Promised Land, and that searing, heartbroken, A Time to Break Silence, delivered at Riverside Church in New York 1 year to the day of his murder in Memphis, a grim date whose 40th anniversary we will commemorate this Friday. These are sermons in which one hears an unmistakably heightened prophetic urgency and, one might say, an eschatological intensification. In those late years of 1967 and 1968, with chaos and disillusionment all around, and with so many of his early supporters long gone, Dr. King railed against the prophesying of smooth patriotism and against those who would exchange devotion to the teachings of Jesus with the Southern way of life and with American ambition. With America unhinged by violence at home and abroad, King's final sermons read at places as a lament for the nation. It is midnight in our world today, he said. We are experiencing a darkness so deep we can hardly see which way to turn. Everywhere, paralyzing fears harrow people by day and haunt them by night. I fear our nation's soul has been poisoned. Our world is sick with war. The words are telling. 10 years earlier, this same Baptist preacher, while serving a church in Montgomery, Alabama, had summoned together a group of social gospel reformers calling themselves the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, pursuing the mission to redeem the soul of America. But now, if there is any redemption to be found in the darkening soulscape of the nation, as the war cast its shadows over those glorious, though short-lived experiments in social reform, it will not be found in military might or political power or the acquisition of material possessions. Our only hope today, Dr. King says, lies in our ability to recapture the revolutionary spirit and to rededicate ourselves to the long and bitter but oh so beautiful struggle for a new world. This is the calling of the children of the living God. We stand, Dr. King said, in the fierce urgency of now. My students are sometimes surprised to learn that when Dr. King came to Montgomery in the spring of 1954, actually it wasn't Dr. King, it was A.B.D. King at the time, all but dissertation, civil rights activism was not his top priority. King came to Montgomery because Dexter Avenue Baptist Church offered a nice salary, a comfortable parsonage, and a highly educated congregation. Dexter had no interest in racial crusading either. Church members there had long prided themselves on their access to white elites and their own relative social privilege. They certainly shared a common hope in a future without Jim Crow, but they were not going to ignite the fires of the dissent themselves. At least the majority wasn't. In fact, Dr. King actually had to be talked into accepting the leadership of the newly formed Montgomery Improvement Association by Ralph Abernathy when the organization was formed the day after Rosa Parks refused to move from her seat in the front of the bus. And King accepted only after being reassured, or perhaps sort of tricked into thinking, it's not clear, that the boycott would be over in a day. He was busy with other things. In King's first list of demands as president of the Montgomery Improvement Association, he made clear that the protest was not about challenging segregation. The NAACP refused to endorse King's list, and the members of the African American community who were ready to take on Southern apartheid felt betrayed, and many were furious. King was no fan of nonviolence either. One of my favorite stories comes from Glenn Smiley, a staff member for the Fellowship of Reconciliation, who was in Montgomery in early January 1956 trying to develop principles of nonviolence, writing in a field report back to his office in Texas how surprised he was to discover an arsenal in the parsonage on South Jackson Street. When I was in graduate school, King said, "I thought the only way we could solve our problem was through an armed revolt." By the end of the second month of the boycott, King had fallen into despair about his leadership and the direction of the movement. The protest was in disarray, and the fragile unity was on the verge of breaking down. On a gloomy day in mid-January 1956, feeling that he was a failure, demoralized, exhausted, Dr. King, now Dr. King, offered his resignation as the president of the protest group. It wasn't accepted, but his doubts about his abilities as pastor and organizer remained strong. The next week, King returned late one night to his parsonage after a long day of organizing and planning session. He had also just endured his first arrest and incarceration and wanted nothing but to climb into bed and surrender to a good night's rest. But just as he was preparing to do just that, the phone rang, and on the other end of the line rushed a torrent of obscene words, and then a death threat. "Listen," N-word, "we've taken all we want from you. Before next week, you'll be sorry you ever came to Montgomery." King hung up without comment, as had become his custom, but hopes of much-needed rest were gone. Threatening phone calls had become a daily routine throughout the weeks of the protest. What may have appeared to the NAACP to be too cautious in his approach appeared, of course, to the guardians of white supremacy to be altogether subversive. In recent days, though, the phone calls had started to take a toll, increasing in number to 30 or 40 and becoming much more menacing. There was something still, though, about this call. The exhaustion, sense of failure, the arrest of the previous night. King felt himself suddenly seized with fear. He says, I got out of bed and began to walk the floor. I'd heard these things before, but for some reason that night it got to me. King walked down the hall, made a pot of coffee, and sat down at the kitchen table. I was ready to give up. I felt myself faltering, he said. With his head buried now in his hands, King bowed over the kitchen, and as he tells us in his memoir, began to pray aloud. Lord, I'm down here trying to do what's right, but I confess that I'm weak now. I'm faltering, I'm losing my courage. I'm afraid, I'm at the end of my powers. I have nothing left. I've come to the point where I can't face it alone. Out of the deep silences of that Alabama night, King heard a voice say, Martin Luther, stand up for righteousness, stand up for justice, stand up for truth, and I will be with you even into the end of the world. King tells us that he heard the voice of Jesus. I heard the voice of Jesus saying, still to fight on. He promised never to leave me alone. No, never alone. No, never alone. He promised never to leave me alone. And as the voice washed over the wretched words of the caller, King reached a shore beyond anxiety and despair. I experienced the presence of the divine as I had never experienced it before, he said. My fear slowly began to go. My uncertainty disappeared. I was ready to face anything. A week later, and a few days after his home was bombed by Klan terrorists, King preached a sermon at the Dexter Avenue Baptist Church called, It's Hard to Be a Christian. We don't have the sermon manuscript, though thanks to the wonderful work of Claiborne Carson and his editorial team at the King Papers Project at Stanford, we have the notes of that message that have just been published. The sermon was based on chapter 16, verse 24 of St. Matthew's Gospel. If any person will come after me, let him deny himself and take up his cross and follow me. Most of us in the American congregations, King wrote in his notes and preached that Sunday, have substituted a cushion for a cross. We have substituted the soothing lemonade of escape for the bitter cup of reality. But Jesus never left men and women with such illusions. He made it crystal clear that his gospel was difficult because it demanded a dangerous and costly altruism. Authentic faith is hard, he said, because it demands that the I be immersed in the deep waters of the thou, that we put our whole being in the struggle against inhumanity and in service to the disenfranchised and the downtrodden. From that year until the end of his life in April 1968, King bet everything on the proposition that the immanence of agape, as he wrote, can be concretely conceived in human nature and history. In the crucible of lived experience, King came to realize that intellectual abstractions cannot and do not empower acts of compassion and sacrifice or sustain the courage to speak against the day. In that 1967 address at Riverside Church in New York, King resolved that America's only hope lay in the spirit of repentance, in the willingness to be a servant among the nations by caring preferentially and creatively for the poor and broken and distressed. Repentance may not be part of the grammar of the secular university, but for King it was the very condition of the dream. In the final weeks of this 382-day protest that launched the 20th century's greatest social movement, King told a jubilant audience at the Holt Street Baptist Church, which had just received word from the U.S. Supreme Court in favor of the Montgomery Improvement Association's challenge of segregation. Dr. King said that while we will need to protest and we will need to boycott, we will need to contest the material conditions of injustice and of discrimination, the end is not the boycott. The end is not the protest. The end of our struggle, he said, is reconciliation. The end is redemption. The end is creation of beloved community. Well, for more than a decade now, I have been writing and researching lived theology. The work has involved exploring how ideas about religious convictions and theological commitments shape social and political practice and conceptions of community, justice, reconciliation, and responsibility. Richard Rorty's classes here in the late 1980s, his intellectual courage, and his writings, particularly the books Contingency, Irony, and Solidarity, Achieving Our Country, and Philosophy and Social Hope, helped teach me that the intellectual life must seek to promote human flourishing, prevent cruelty, and strengthen and build solidarity among diverse communities. Disengagement from practice produces theoretical hallucinations, he once said in one of his writings. And for his life and his legacy and his many acts of kindness to me as a graduate student in religious studies, I will be forever grateful. Still, it was Dr. King and the theological agitators and reformers and dreamers whose lives I have studied and celebrated over these past years who have taught me that disciplined and focused and sustained practice requires spiritual nourishment and religious hope. Visit a soup kitchen, a hospitality house, a tutorial program for low-income children, an AIDS clinic, a hunger relief agency, a Habitat for Humanity site, a student group sitting in an administrative building in support of a living wage for university workers. And you will find there people who are moved to act for others, who live passionately into the depths and breadths of the world's concrete needs because they see a light shining in the darkness, who believe that transcendence empowers rather than diminishes the love of life, that hope and miracle and mystery animate the protest against cruelty, focus moral energies, and heighten discernment of those places in the world that call out for healing and wholeness. The philosopher Søren Kierkegaard wrote of faith as the most complex artwork, and yet the most exquisite. And indeed, if you listen closely, you will hear that the men and women who work day in and day out in inauspicious places to bring healing to our broken and blistered world, whether they are Christian, or Jew, or Muslim, or Buddhist, or Hindus, or variations on the above, are people who are carried and strengthened and nourished by deep spiritual waters, who show that vivid and synoptic realism, if you will, about the nature of social existence is more honest and clearly drawn against horizons of grace. Dr. King spoke of the spiritual movement in Montgomery. Clarence Jordan, another hero of the God movement in southeast Georgia. Fannie Lou Hamer of the New Kingdom in Mississippi. John Perkins of the Quiet Revolution of building hope in distressed and excluded communities. Mark Gornick of the Shalom of the City. Victoria Gray Adams of the Inflession Church of peacemakers and reconcilers. These men and women have led me gently through a re-education as a scholar, citizen, and person of faith. And this brings me to my final words tonight in my last lecture at the university. I can no longer evade the glaring, nagging, relentless fact that the theologians whom I have come back to time and again as sources of hope and courage and imaginative discipline all did in fact go away. Out of the conviction that they could be of greater service, living and working in more direct connection to life, they left the academy. They embarked on the journey from the phraseological to the real, as Dietrich Bonhoeffer said of his decision to leave his teaching post at the University of Berlin and give himself fully to the resistance movement against Hitler. So after much thought and prayer, I have decided to take leave of the academic world as well and join the ranks of those practitioners and writers and diagnosticians of the soul who keep the mystery alive in the plenitude of everyday life. I hope you know how much I have loved my years at the university, especially the time with students and the times when I've been part of an exchange between scholar and practitioner that is fresh and vital, when I can see a student's eyes light up with a new understanding of the possibilities of knowledge. I'm not sure where this is leading me. It's a terrifying thing to be doing, leaving the comforts of academe. But these same comforts have a way of coming to feel like a tightening vice. 10 years ago, I might have purchased a patch of land in Forest County, Mississippi, not too far from my hometown of Laurel, but not too far from New Orleans either, so when those deep South Protestant blues come a-calling, we could take refuge in the great old Catholic city for a few days. And here on this farm, students and activists and scholars would come to share meals and conversation, to sing and pray, and simply try to be a space filled with grace and peace. But since I know nothing about farming, I will leave this to those students of mine growing in number who are making the connection anew between theology and land. There is no single social movement that beckons. There are many worthy campaigns that might solicit my energies. Campaigns gathering around global hunger, human rights, environmental ethics, gun control, health care, affordable housing. You know what these are, and you know many more. I will no doubt drift into these campaigns, but my greater calling is to live simply in closer proximity to the people and places whose stories I wish to tell in my remaining years. I will try to stay closer to the ground, to listen and to ask questions, and to document this strange world we live in, the fascinating and tragic comic and wholly unpredictable ways people live in face of mystery. And I will try to find ways of putting into narrative, with as much clarity and beauty as I can, the hope and the joy and the goodness from which we will all have to borrow like mad in the uncertain years ahead. Thank you.